Hi there. My name is D.G. Valdron. This is my attic. I'm a writer. These are my books. And my most recent book is called Starlost Unauthorized and the Quest for Canadian Identity. You may not have heard of Starlost. It was a television show that was made back in 1973. It lasted a whole 16 episodes. And then it became infamous due to Harlan Ellison. Now, in another video, I'll slag the hell out of Harlan Ellison. But I want to talk about the show itself and why I think it's interesting. Now, the premise of the show is actually, pretty standard. It's pretty neat. Basically, it's set on a generation ship. Earth has gone, toasty Wheaties. It's gone. All of humanity is stuck, left on this generation ship, which is a cluster of domes, which is drifting through space. There's been an accident. The crew's been killed off. So the ship is basically, unmonitored. And because it's drifted off course, it's heading into a sun. And lo and behold, it's centuries later. A small group of people, Devin, Garth, and Rachel, end up leaving their dome and they discover, holy cow, we are on a spaceship. We didn't even know. And then they go, oh, this is going to hit a sun. We should do something. That's the whole series. All right, decent premise. It's not terribly new. There have been stories about generation ships and even generation ships that have been reduced to savagery going back 50, 60 years. I mean, Star Trek did the premise. And it goes all the way back to, Pulp Fiction in the 1930s. But Starlost kind of became interesting to me because at the time that it was being made, and it was being made in Canada, what happened was there was a writer's strike down in the United States. They needed someplace else to make the show, so they sent it up to Canada, basically dodging out past the writer's strike. Anyway, when they sent it up to Canada, it got interesting because Canada at that time was going through its great big national identity crisis. Canada had been basically a British colony. It had been a sort of confederation of provinces. And now in the 1960s and into the 1970s, it was undergoing this sort of national soul searching, Who were we as Canadians? What did we stand for as Canadians? Were we just Americans with tucks and funny boots? Or were we British subjects? Well, British subjects doesn't seem to be working out anymore. The British Empire had kind of gone bye-bye. And so Canada in the late 1960s, early 70s had set about building a kind of a national identity. And suddenly we had Expo 1967. We had the Olympics in 1976. We had a national flag suddenly in 1973. Can you believe it? We'd gotten by a whole century without even having a flag of our own? Go figure. And along the way, we had some things that we had to struggle with. Not just the fact that, we didn't even know who we were as a country. We had regionalism. So Quebec speaking French was off on its own. It had its own independence movement. Out west, the Albertans were, talking separation and, basically hostile to the rest of Canada. British Columbia was off in its la-la land. The Maritimes were ignored as always. Canada was a bunch of regions that weren't getting along and really didn't like or know each other. At the same time, down south, we had the overwhelming presence of the United States, 10 times our size, and this flood of media coming over the border, books, television, magazines. The United States had these gigantic economies of scale, and our country was a ribbon about 300 miles thick. That was where all the people were, 3,000 miles long. And so economics just dictated that American product would be coming and coming and coming. And Americans with their money were coming up and buying our country out from under us. There were a lot of national conflicts about that. So we were trying to not only form a national identity from all these different regions, but we were trying to defend this national identity from this overwhelming American presence. And America, during this period of time, was not a happy place. 1973 is Nixon land. 1973 is years into the Vietnam War, the secret bombing of Cambodia, the overthrow of the Chilean government, the uh, a lot of just ugly, cantankerous things going on internationally because of the CIA. And how many times had they tried to kill Fidel Castro by that time? Tons. And at the same time, there was strife back home in the US. So Martin Luther King had been killed, Malcolm X, the Kennedys had been murdered. The civil rights movement was in full flower. You know, people were still sitting in and fighting segregation big time. The Supreme Court was about to, come in with the Bakke case and busing, women's rights, everything. The United States was in this cauldron of strife and disagreement and national anger. Hippies were getting shot, and hard hats and rednecks were demonstrating in the streets. Um, and there was pollution, and there was militarism, runaway militarism. Canadians were looking down at that, and they were going, "What the living hell? That's definitely not us." We were trying to find our own identity, and part of that was trying to distinguish our identity from this titan to the south, which was having some really bad times and expressing some values that were pretty antithetical to us. And so we come to Starlost. Now, during this time, of course, we were finding we had to build our culture. So you had a lot of the seminal Canadian films coming out around this time, Going Down the Road, Paperback Hero. You had Canadian film industry springing up from overnight. 1973, 3 films made in Canada. 1976, something like 90. Okay, not very good films. This was the tax shelter era. Same thing with television. On Canadian television, out of 2,000 movies that were shown over a 4-year period, 2 of them were Canadian. That's not good for a national identity. You had a better chance of seeing an Italian or a British or a Swedish film on Canadian television than a Canadian film. And it kind of goes on like that, the books and stuff. So we started creating these cultural institutions, the CBC, the CTV uh, network. We started creating all these arts councils. We started creating tax breaks and program funding. All of which was intended to develop a Canadian culture, to fund and subsidize a Canadian culture in the face of a tidal wave. And Starlost, of course, was part of that. Even though the series was officially created by Harlan Ellison, although it had been pushed out by Fox and NBC, it came up here, and because of Canadian content requirements, they had to have a majority of Canadian writers. They had to have a majority of Canadian cast members. So they had Keir Dullea from 2001, A Space Odyssey, as the star, but then they also had William Osler, Gay Rowan, and Robin Ward to fill out the cast, 3 Canadians. And of course, Norman Clenman, a Canadian writer who ended up writing half the series, and other Canadian writers brought in, either expatriates from Hollywood or local. And the fun thing is that if you start to watch the episodes, you get a lot of Canadian culture in it. I mean, it wasn't deliberate. These guys were trying to make an American product for an American audience, but they were Canadian, and I guess they were starting out, so they didn't quite have that lined up. And so as you watch the episodes, there's a Canadian sensibility. People don't do things in it the way that Americans would have. Instead of fistfights, we're rendering first aid. Instead of the hunter and the hunted, everybody's kind of like going, okay, well, I guess we better hang together because it's dangerous out there. Instead, the characters debate whether turning off an artificial intelligence is murder or not, and whether it has a right to exist. They struggle with, what's the right thing under the circumstance. In some of the final episodes, There is actually a debate to the death. And it's a very Canadian debate because in this episode, The Return of Oro, the characters are struggling. The arc is drifting. They don't really know what they're doing or where they're going. They're just kind of trying to muddle through. And this guy from a place called XR comes along and he says, let me pull the arc into orbit and turn you into a satellite. I want to do this because your arc has a huge pile of natural resources that we want. It's very valuable to us. And he says, your people can just come in and join us. And Devon, the hero of the show, goes, no, we don't want to lose our independence. We don't want to lose our identity. We don't want to be a satellite of this other place, this other big planet, and be in orbit. And so that's the debate. And there's a risk in terms of going through. The risk is that, the ark may end up destroyed. So it's the choice between safety and security on the one hand, and maybe trying to build your identity, trying to go your own way, even if there's a danger that you're not going to make it. And this is the lovely thing. I watched this decades later, and I recognized that debate because that was the exact debate that we were having in this country at that time. I'd never seen that. There had been a lot of Canadian television from this era and subsequently, but nothing else had ever really kind of put the flag out there. Set 700 years in the future in a place where Canada was long forgotten, but the issues, the ideas, the themes were so very Canadian. And as I said, I don't think they meant it. They just wanted to do something that the Americans would buy. That was the whole point. But instead, maybe because they were inexperienced, they ended up talking about things that were important to them, issues that were meaningful to them. They did things and had a sensibility that was relevant to who they were. I think that's interesting and kind of nice. So, buy my book. Why not? It is at least a different take on things. Oh, and by the way, just one more word. Harlan Ellison was a dick. Thank you.